was 22 years old, and by his own admission, he was the kind of guy who always had a bit running. A group chat full of screenshots and setups. A reputation among his friends for being the one who committed to the joke, the one who didn't break. He told me this about himself without embarrassment, the way people do when they've spent enough time examining a part of their personality to have made peace with it, even when they probably shouldn't have. It was the last week of October. He and his 3 closest friends had spent the better part of a Saturday planning what they were calling the ultimate Halloween prank. The target was their friend Marcus, 23, worked at a logistics company, lived alone in a rental house on a quiet street in the suburbs, about a 15-minute drive from Kyle's apartment. Marcus was famously, legendarily easy to scare. This was an established fact in their friend group. Years of evidence. He screamed at trailers for horror films. He refused to walk to his car alone at night after watching anything scary. His friends had been exploiting this since college, in the small, incremental way that close friend groups do, the kind of low-grade teasing that everyone involved understood was affectionate, Marcus included. He told Kyle more than once that he knew he was a coward. He said it laughing. The plan was straightforward. Kyle's girlfriend, Amber, would text Marcus saying she needed to drop something off at his place and was outside. When Marcus came to the front door, Kyle and 2 others would be waiting in the dark on either side of the porch, in full Halloween costumes. Masks, dark clothes, the works. Marcus would open the door expecting Amber. He would get 3 figures stepping out of the darkness instead. They had rehearsed the positions. They knew the layout of Marcus's porch. They'd been to his house dozens of times, or so they thought. It was just after 9 p.m. when they pulled onto Marcus's street, or what Kyle was almost certain was Marcus's street. He'd driven it in daylight 100 times. At night, in late October, with every third house decorated in dim orange lighting and fake cobwebs and inflatable skeletons on the lawn, the street looked subtly different. Not wrong, exactly, just less familiar than he expected. He slowed the car down. "That's his place," said one of his friends, Jordan, pointing to a dark house with a shallow porch and a black mailbox near the road. Kyle nodded. It looked right. The same single oak tree in the front yard. The same white aluminum siding he remembered. Same general layout of the windows. Amber sent the text. "We're outside, just dropping something off. Come to the door." They got out of the car, quiet as they could manage. 3 of them crossed the lawn in the dark, Kyle, Jordan, and their friend Dev, all in black with masks pulled down. They positioned themselves on either side of the front door and waited. Inside, nothing moved for a moment. Then a light came on somewhere toward the back of the house. Then footsteps. Slow, unhurried footsteps, moving toward the front. Kyle felt the grin behind his mask. He heard Jordan shift his weight, suppressing a laugh. Dev was already shaking. The footsteps reached the door. There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone looks through a peephole. And then the door opened. The man standing in the doorway was not Marcus. He was older, considerably older, maybe mid-60s. He was wearing a plain white undershirt and dark trousers, like someone who had been watching television and not expecting company. He was heavy-set, with close-cropped gray hair, and he had the specific physical stillness of a person who is not easily startled. He looked at Kyle. He looked at Jordan. He looked at Dev. And he did not react the way someone is supposed to react. He did not jump back. He did not shout. He did not make a sound at all. He just stood there, looking at 3 masked figures on his porch at 9 o'clock at night, with an expression that Kyle described to me as not fear, not confusion, not even anger. Recognition. Like he had been expecting something like this. Like this was, to him, a confirmation of something he already believed. Kyle pulled his mask up immediately. He started talking fast. He said they had the wrong house. They were looking for their friend down the street. They were so sorry. They were just doing a Halloween thing. He was using his most disarming voice, his most cooperative body language, hands visible, stepping back from the door. All the instinctive signals of a person trying to de-escalate something they hadn't meant to escalate. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You need to leave this property." Not screaming, not threatening, just flat, absolute. The tone of someone delivering a fact. Kyle said yes, absolutely, so sorry. They were leaving. He turned to Jordan and Dev and made the get to the car motion with his head. And that's when he heard the sound from inside the house. He can't fully describe it, even now. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't an animal. It was somewhere between a scrape and a shift, the sound of something large moving, deliberately, in a room just out of sight. The kind of sound that does not belong in a house where a single older man is watching television on a quiet October night. He didn't stop to think about it. He walked off that porch. He walked fast. Jordan and Dev were already at the car. Amber, who had been watching from the passenger seat, said later that all three of them came back looking like different people than the ones who had left. She said she knew immediately that something had gone wrong, but she didn't ask until they were 3 blocks away and Kyle had finally stopped checking the rearview mirror. He told her what happened. The wrong house. The man in the doorway. The sound. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Kyle, I didn't text Marcus." He looked at her. She held up her phone. She'd been about to send the text when he told everyone to get out of the car. She'd assumed he or someone else had already sent it. She had never sent anything. Marcus's phone had received no message that night. She showed him the screen. Nothing sent, which meant that the man in the white undershirt had not opened his door because he got a text from someone he knew. He had opened his door because someone was on his porch. He had known they were there before the door ever opened. Kyle drove back down the street, slowly, at a distance, just to confirm what he already suspected. Marcus's house was 4 doors down. Same siding, yes. Similar layout, but unmistakably a different house once you were standing in front of the right one. The oak tree was on the wrong side. The mailbox was a different shape. In daylight, he would never have made the mistake. He spent more time than he can calculate thinking about what was in that house. About the sound. About the way the man had looked at them. Not like someone being surprised, but like someone whose suspicion had just been confirmed. He doesn't know what that man believed was happening on his porch that night. He doesn't know what he was protecting, or from what, or what the sound was. He knows that the man opened the door calmly, that he told them to leave calmly, and that the way he said it left no room in Kyle's body for anything except immediate compliance. He found Marcus's actual house, knocked on the door the normal way. Marcus answered in sweatpants eating chips, completely unbothered. The prank never happened. Kyle couldn't have explained the setup even if he tried. He just said, "Hey, we were in the neighborhood." They went inside and watched a movie. Kyle didn't tell any of them what had happened for almost 2 weeks. He said he needed to sit with it first, to decide if it was funny yet. He told me, "It still isn't." Jess and her roommate Tori had been best friends since freshman orientation, and by the spring of their junior year they had built something they were both proud of. A long, elaborate, mutually acknowledged prank war. 2.5 years in the making. Documented in a shared notes app that they updated after every round. The rules were unspoken but understood. Nothing that causes real damage. Nothing in public that couldn't be controlled. Nothing that a stranger might witness and genuinely believe was a crisis. That last rule, it turned out, was a lot harder to enforce than either of them had anticipated. It was a Friday in April. Jess was ahead on points. She had spent the better part of a Thursday evening setting up what she believed was her masterpiece. Their shared apartment had a bathroom with a frosted glass window that looked out onto the building's interior hallway. If you stood in the hallway at the right angle, you could see light and movement through the glass but no detail. Jess had rigged a Bluetooth speaker behind the bathroom cabinet, connected it to her phone, and loaded a sound file she'd spent 2 hours finding and editing. A specific kind of screaming. The kind that sounds genuinely desperate, genuinely terrified. The plan was this. When Tori went to take a shower around 9 p.m., which she did every single Friday without exception, Jess would trigger the sound file from her bedroom. The speaker would make it sound like screaming was coming from inside the walls of the bathroom. Tori would freak out. Jess would let it run for 30 seconds, then knock on the door and say gotcha. They would laugh. Jess would update the notes app. Tori would spend the next week plotting her revenge. Clean, contained, between two people who had established consent through 2.5 years of exactly this kind of thing. That was the plan. At 9:07 p.m., Tori went into the bathroom and closed the door. Jess, sitting cross-legged on her bed in the dark with her phone, grinned and hit play. The screaming started. It was, Jess admitted to me, louder than she tested it. She tried the speaker in her bedroom and it had sounded contained. Through the bathroom walls, in a building with thin construction and narrow hallways, it carried differently, much differently. From the bathroom, Tori shouted, "Jess, oh my God, already? Really?" She'd recognized it immediately. Of course she had. 2.5 years of this. Jess started laughing. She was about to walk over and knock on the door, tell her to come out. It was just the speaker. That's when she heard the first door in the hallway open. Then a second door. Then voices. Then, unmistakably, a knock on their apartment door. Hard, urgent, and a male voice saying, "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" We can hear screaming. Jess stood up from her bed and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She stopped the sound file. She went to the apartment door and opened it. Two of her neighbors were in the hallway. A man from the apartment directly above theirs, in a t-shirt and socks like he'd come down very quickly. A woman from across the hall who Jess recognized but had never formally met. Both of them were looking at her with the specific expression of people who had genuinely heard something they were genuinely worried about. Jess said quickly, "It's okay. It was just a prank. I'm so sorry. My roommate and I were doing a bit. It was a speaker. Nobody's hurt." The man stared at her. He said, "That didn't sound like a bit." She told him again. "Speaker. Prank. Bluetooth. All fine." He said okay. They went back to their apartments. Jess closed the door and pressed her back against it and let out a long breath. Tori came out of the bathroom in her towel. She looked at Jess's face and said, "What happened?" Jess told her. Neighbors in the hallway. The man from upstairs. The woman across the hall. Tori's expression shifted, in a way Jess described as the first time she'd ever seen her roommate genuinely unsettled by something in their prank war. They agreed, quietly, that it was lucky it had ended there. That it could have been worse. That someone could have called the police. That police responding to a screaming woman call, finding a speaker and two college students in a dark apartment, was a situation with outcomes neither of them wanted to think about too carefully. They updated the notes app. Jess logged it as a partial point, with an asterisk. A note that said, "Escalated further than intended. Needs to not happen again." They thought it was over. They were wrong. 3 days later, on a Monday evening, Jess got a knock on the apartment door. She opened it expecting a package, or a neighbor, or Tori having forgotten her keys. It was the man from upstairs. He was calmer than he'd been on Friday night. More deliberate. He introduced himself properly this time. His name was Owen. He was a graduate student, had lived in the building for 2 years. He said he wanted to talk to her about what had happened. Jess invited him in. She offered him a seat. She was already preparing her most thorough apology. He sat down and looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I'm not saying this to make you feel bad." She said, "Okay." He said, "My sister was in an abusive relationship for 3 years. During that time, there were several incidents where neighbors heard screaming and didn't do anything, because they told themselves it was probably nothing. Probably just a couple arguing. Probably just the TV. They didn't want to get involved. And she spent 3 years hoping that someone would come through a door or pick up a phone or do something, and nobody did. Nobody did anything at all." He paused. He wasn't angry. That was the thing Jess kept coming back to when she told me this. He wasn't angry at all. He said, "On Friday night, I heard screaming and I came downstairs. And I'm glad it was a prank. I'm genuinely glad. But I want you to know what the sound was to me. What it made me do. Because the next time you set something like that up, I need you to know that for some people, that sound is not a bit. It is not funny. It is the specific sound of something we have spent our whole lives being afraid we'd hear and not respond to fast enough. Jess sat with that for a long time after he left. She and Tori talked about it for most of the night, and then they opened the shared notes app and deleted it. The prank war was over, not because it had gotten out of hand, technically, not because anyone had gotten hurt, but because Owen had said something that neither of them could unhear, that the thing they had built their friendship around, the bits and setups and carefully engineered moments of fear, existed inside a larger world. A world where the same sounds, the same moments of staged terror, meant something completely different to people they would never know. People standing on the other side of a thin wall, holding their breath, deciding whether or not to knock. Jess told me she's thought about him a lot since then. About his sister, about the neighbors who didn't come. She said, "I used to be proud of how committed I was to the bit, how far I'd go to sell it. I'm not proud of that anymore, because I understand now that committing to a bit means committing to making fear feel real. And fear is not a game. It never was. I just didn't know enough to understand that yet." I want to be honest with you about this last story. It is the hardest one to tell, because it does not end cleanly. There is no moment of relief, no punchline that resolves into laughter, no lesson that arrives wrapped in a bow. It ends in a way that the person who lived it is still living with, and I think you need to know that going in. His name is Danny. He's 28 now. At the time this happened, he was 24, and he was on a road trip with 2 college friends, a 12-hour drive across 2 states to visit a friend who'd moved to a city neither of them had been to before. It was June. They were in good spirits, the kind of road trip energy that makes everything feel like a bit. They were maybe 4 hours into the drive when they came up with the idea. They'd been driving through a stretch of 2-lane highway, rural, flat, the kind of landscape that goes on long enough to make you restless. They needed something to do. And somewhere around the 3-hour mark, one of them, Danny can't remember who, and maybe that's deliberate, pointed at a gas station coming up on the right and said they should do the jumper cables thing. The jumper cables thing. You may have seen a version of this. Someone stands on the side of the road holding jumper cables attached to nothing, giving the cables a shake as cars pass, like they're trying to flag someone down for help. It looks, from a distance, like a person in distress. Cars slow down, some stop, and then the person on the side of the road waves them off with a laugh and a thumbs up, and the car drives away, and everyone in both vehicles has a story. It sounds harmless. I understand why it sounds harmless. I need you to hold on to that, and hold on to what actually happened. At the same time, they pulled into the gas station. One of them, a guy named Rook, took the jumper cables from the back of the car. Danny's other friend, Caleb, stayed in the car as the spotter, watching the road and ready to give a thumbs up when a vehicle was far enough out to see Rook on the shoulder but close enough that the timing would work. Danny stood a few feet behind Rook, phone up, filming. The first 2 cars slowed, saw Rook wave them off, drove on. One gave a confused honk. The second one, the driver leaned out and shouted something that was either a laugh or a rebuke. Danny genuinely couldn't tell at the distance. They kept going. The third vehicle to come down that stretch of highway was a pickup truck. It slowed. It pulled off the road behind them. Danny noted, without attaching much significance to it, that it pulled off farther back than you'd expect. Most people who stopped to help pull in close enough to talk, close enough to connect the cables. This truck stopped a good 30 feet behind where Rook was standing, and it sat there, engine running, for a moment, before the driver's door opened. The man who got out was large, not tall, but broad, wide across the shoulders, with the build of someone who had done physical labor his entire life and hadn't stopped. He was maybe 50. He was wearing a gray work shirt and boots, and he was not, Danny noticed immediately, smiling. He was not doing the thing people usually did when they figured out the prank, that moment of relief blending into mild exasperation. He was walking toward Rook with no expression on his face at all. Rook started the wave off. He held up his hand, he grinned, he started to say the thing he'd been saying for the last 2 cars. "It's all good, man, just a prank. The man didn't slow down. He walked up to Rook and stopped about 2 feet from him. He looked at the jumper cables. He looked at Danny with the phone. He looked back at Rook, and he said, in a voice that Danny described to me as the flattest human voice he had ever heard in his life, "You think that's funny?" It wasn't a question. Rook said, "Yeah, it was just a prank. No harm done. Really sorry if it was annoying." Still grinning, still trying to diffuse it with lightness. The grin was a mistake. Danny could see it was a mistake from where he was standing, but he didn't know what to do with that information fast enough. The man said, "I drove 40 minutes out of my way, in my own truck, on my own time, because I saw someone who looked like they needed help." Rook's grin faded. The man said, "My son broke down on this highway 2 years ago, on a night in February, and nobody stopped. He sat on the side of this road for 3 hours in February, because people decided it wasn't worth the trouble to find out if someone needed help. He had his hazards on. He had his hood up, and not one person stopped. He wasn't raising his voice." That was the detail that Danny kept coming back to, that he wasn't shouting, wasn't threatening, wasn't doing anything you could point to and say, "This man is a danger." He was just standing on the side of the highway, telling the truth, and every word of it was landing somewhere in Danny's chest that he hadn't known was there. He said, "I stop for every person I see on the side of the road now. Every one. Because I know what it costs when people don't. And you," he looked at Rook, and then at Danny, and then, slowly, at the car where Caleb was sitting. "Use that. You used the thing that made me stop." Nobody said anything. The man looked at them for a long moment. Then he walked back to his truck. He got in. He drove away. He did not look back. Danny told me that none of them spoke for almost 10 minutes after that. They stood on the side of the highway in the June heat, and they didn't say a single word to each other. Then Rook coiled up the jumper cables very carefully and put them back in the trunk, and they got in the car, and they drove. The rest of the road trip happened. They saw their friend. They did the things you do on a trip like that. But Danny said something had shifted in the car, in the air between the three of them, that didn't shift back. Like a frequency that had been changed and couldn't be tuned to what it was before. He told me he's thought about that man almost every week since then. About the sun on the highway in February. About the 3 hours. About every car that passed and kept going. He said, "We didn't do anything that bad. I know that. We didn't hurt anyone. Nobody was physically in danger. And I've told myself that. I've told myself we were just kids being stupid on a road trip, and the guy overreacted a little, and it was an awkward 5 minutes, and that's all it was." He paused for a long time. "But I don't actually believe that, because the prank only works if the person who stops believes, completely, that someone needs help. The entire joke is that their decency is the punchline. And when someone whose decency was built out of something real, out of actual loss, out of a night his son spent sitting in the cold waiting for someone decent enough to stop, when that person is the one who shows up." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "There's no version of that where I'm the good guy. There's no angle from which that was okay. And I think I'd always known that, somewhere. I just never had to look at it directly before." He still drives that same route occasionally. He says every time he passes that stretch of highway, he checks the shoulder. Out of habit now. Out of something that isn't quite guilt and isn't quite obligation, but sits somewhere between the two. Something he picked up that afternoon and never put down. He told me he stopped for people 3 times since then. Twice for flat tires. Once for a woman whose car had stalled in the rain. All 3 times, real. All 3 times, grateful. He said he's not sure what that makes him. Whether it counts for anything. Whether you can build something decent out of something that wasn't. He said, "I think you can try. I think trying is the only thing available to you once you understand what you did. So I try. Every time I pass someone on the side of the road, I try. 3 pranks. A Halloween scare that landed on the wrong door, and whatever was behind it. A speaker in a bathroom wall, and a man who came downstairs because his sister had needed someone to come downstairs. A pair of jumper cables on a summer highway, and the father who had learned, at cost, that some people do not have the luxury of deciding whether stopping is worth the trouble. None of these pranks were designed to cause harm. I want to be clear about that. Kyle and Jess and Danny are not bad people. They are not cautionary tales about moral failure. They are just people who set something in motion in a world that is larger and more complicated than the space of the joke. A world full of people carrying things you cannot see, history you weren't told about, losses that have been converted, quietly, into the way they move through every situation that resembles the one that broke them. That is what each of these pranks walked into. Not a monster, not a villain, just a person with a past, who crossed paths with a setup they weren't meant to be part of. I don't think the lesson is, don't laugh, don't play, don't find joy in the unexpected. I don't believe that. But I do think there is a version of being funny that requires taking seriously the world the joke is landing in. That requires understanding that fear, and help, and desperation are not props. They carry weight. The kind of weight that belongs to real people in real moments that had nothing to do with you. And sometimes, those people are the ones who show up. Kyle still thinks about the sound from inside that house. Jess thinks about Owen's sister. Danny stops for every person he sees on the side of the road. Each of them, in their own way, was changed by the moment the prank stopped being a prank. By the moment the world outside the joke walked in, looked them in the eye, and showed them exactly what they'd been playing with. I'll leave you with that. If you've been part of a prank that went somewhere you didn't expect, share it in the comments. You might be surprised how many people understand exactly what you mean. I'll see you next time.